Mr. Jones, a man of routine, up before the sun, always working on something. He kept to himself, but he was a good tenant. Always paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble. He had lived in the small apartment complex for 5 years. Everyone knew him. Everyone liked him. He was quiet and respectful, a model tenant. No one suspected a thing. Mr. Jones was a handyman. He could fix anything. Leaky faucet? No problem. Broken door hinge? Easy. He would often help his neighbors with their own repairs, never asked for much in return, just a friendly face and a cup of coffee. He was always happy to lend a hand. It was just who he was. He was particularly close to Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived downstairs. Her late husband had been a carpenter, and she appreciated Mr. Jones's skills. He would help her with groceries, change light bulbs, and even fix her old vacuum cleaner. He was a godsend for her, especially after her husband passed away. She often told him he was like the son she never had. He would just smile and shrug it off, but everyone knew he cared for her deeply. One cold Tuesday evening, everything changed. The usual peace of the apartment complex was shattered. Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder by the second. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the night sky. Confused residents peered out their windows, trying to understand the commotion. Fear hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, heavily armed figures in black uniforms swarmed the building. They moved with precision and purpose, their faces grim. The hallway echoed with the sound of heavy boots and shouts. Doors were smashed open, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. Terrified screams pierced the night. It was chaos. It was terrifying. Then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The police emerged from Mr. Jones's apartment, their faces etched with disgust. They dragged him out in handcuffs, his face pale and drawn. Behind him, the apartment was in ruins. Furniture was overturned, drawers were ransacked, and the floor was littered with debris. The air was thick with the smell of marijuana and something else, something chemical and harsh. The residents watched in stunned silence as their quiet neighbor was shoved into the back of a police car. Mrs. Peterson, frail and trembling, watched from her doorway. She couldn't believe her eyes. Mr. Jones, arrested! It felt like a terrible dream, a cruel joke. But the handcuffs on his wrists and the look of shame on his face told a different story. The world she thought she knew had been turned upside down. Her heart ached, a dull, throbbing pain in her chest. The following days were a blur of whispers and accusations. The once peaceful apartment complex was now a crime scene. The smell of chemicals lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the raid. The residents, once friendly and trusting, now eyed each other with suspicion. The sense of community, once so strong, had been irrevocably broken. Mr. Jones's apartment was deemed a health hazard. The police found evidence of a meth lab hidden in plain sight. The entire building had to be evacuated for a week while a hazmat team cleaned up the toxic mess. Residents were forced to find temporary housing, scrambling to pack their belongings and find a place to stay. The financial burden was immense, especially for those living paycheck to paycheck. Mrs. Peterson, already struggling with the loss of her husband, was particularly devastated. She had no family nearby and had to rely on the kindness of strangers for shelter. Her meager savings were quickly dwindling, and the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on her frail shoulders. The betrayal she felt cut deep. Mr. Jones, the man she had trusted like a son, had put her and her neighbors in danger. After a week of displacement, the residents were finally allowed to return to their homes. The air was clear now, the chemical smell gone, but the emotional scars remained. The building, once a symbol of community and shared experience, now felt cold and impersonal. The residents kept to themselves, their faces etched with a mixture of anxiety and distrust. The landlord, a kind but firm man, was forced to increase the rent. The cost of the cleanup and the lost income from the evacuation had taken a toll. For many residents already struggling to make ends meet, the increase was a devastating blow. Some were forced to move out, unable to afford the higher rent. The community, once a tapestry of different lives and stories, was unraveling thread by thread. Mrs. Peterson, her health deteriorating, found herself increasingly isolated. She missed Mr. Jones, the man she had known before the raid, the man who helped her with groceries and fixed her vacuum cleaner. She knew he had done wrong, but she couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He had made a terrible mistake, one that had cost him everything. But what about her? What about all the innocent people who had been caught in the crossfire? The story of Mr. Jones and the meth lab became a local news sensation. For a week, his face was plastered across newspapers and television screens. He became a symbol of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. But as quickly as the story had emerged, it faded from the public consciousness. Life went on, the news cycle moved on. But for the residents of the small apartment complex, the impact of that night continued to reverberate. Mr. Jones's actions had set off a chain reaction, the consequences of which were still being felt months later. The financial burden, the emotional distress, the erosion of trust, these were the invisible scars left behind. His story served as a stark reminder that our actions have consequences, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. Even the smallest of choices can have a ripple effect, impacting the lives of others in ways we may never fully comprehend. The apartment complex was never the same. The sense of community, once so strong, had been shattered. The residents, once bound by a shared sense of place and belonging, were now strangers living side by side. Mr. Jones's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the far-reaching consequences of our actions. It was a tale of betrayal, loss, and the enduring power of the human spirit to persevere in the face of adversity.